Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of News from a World in Flux. I'm Clare Farrell.
I'm Dr Charlie Gardner.
And today we're going to have a conversation about a whole bunch of different news topics relating to climate and activism. One thing we're definitely going to talk about is the latest climate science, carbon emissions, temperatures going up. We'll talk a little bit about the legal cases that have been going through the courts at the moment, some successes. Sometimes I'm a bit hesitant to be too positive about them, but we'll go into some detail about that. And then finally, a new report which came out earlier this year from a bunch of actuaries who are predicting the numbers of people who may die as a result of climate warming and global breakdown. So it's the usual joy from us. Charlie.
Yeah, all the trends are heading in the wrong direction and unfortunately are accelerating in the wrong direction. So yeah, as you said, the latest data has just been released for January 2025, 1.75 above pre-industrial levels, which is a huge leap beyond 1.5. We talked about what it means a few episodes ago. When will we be able to say we've definitively passed 1.5 in the long term? But it's very clear that in the short term we're leaving it behind in the mirror, and this is concerning a lot of climate scientists because it wasn't supposed to be this hot. I mean, obviously it's getting hotter and hotter because we haven't decarbonised and we're still emitting, but it's accelerating. It's the rises in temperature are larger than we had expected them to be, particularly because we're supposed to be in a La Nina phase. After the last El Nino ended, it was supposed to cool and it hasn't happened. So we've now had 18 of the last 19 months have been above 1.5 on average. And of course, when we talk about 1.5 as a global average, that's not evenly distributed across the planet. The heating is much faster in the poles than in the tropics. So there's a lot of discussion about why we are experiencing this big leap in temperature. Obviously, the underlying mechanism is increases in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So we've had news on that as well. So global emissions in 2024 were higher than they'd been in 2023. That was not unexpected because nobody's taking decarbonisation seriously. But the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere made a big leap. So it jumped to 427 parts per million at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and that's a big leap of 3.6 parts per million in 1 year, which is fucking massive. It's huge. It's much bigger than there's ever been. And this is a real worry because when you look at where that increase in atmospheric concentrations is coming from, it's not just coming from direct anthropogenic sources of emissions. It's not just coming from cars and factories. A huge chunk of it, I can't remember the figure, has come from wildfires. And this is really, really worrying because we've been saying all this time that as we keep heating the planet, we risk starting these runaway processes, these feedback loops that release stored carbon from the Earth system, and it does seem that is happening now. It's got so hot and so dry in so many places around the world that wildfires have become a bigger issue, and wildfires are now a significant driver of increases of atmospheric concentrations. And that's a particular problem, not just because all that carbon is being added to the atmosphere, but it's being added to the atmosphere through the destruction of forests and ecosystems, natural carbon sinks, and they are the sponge that we need to help absorb lots of our other emissions. So when we emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, about a quarter of them are absorbed by the ocean, about a quarter of them are absorbed by vegetation and soil, and half of them remain in the atmosphere where they cause the heating. If we if all the forests get burned, then obviously the land and the soil isn't going to be absorbing a quarter of our emissions anymore, is it? So more of it, a greater proportion of what we emit is going to stay in the atmosphere. So yeah, this is really, really worrying data. On the plus side, we are getting a clearer picture of what this unexpected leap in heat is coming from. And this is something we've talked about a couple of times. Last year we talked about aerosols and how the cleaning up of shipping fuel as a result of an International Maritime Organization piece of legislation in 2020 led to the cleaning up of shipping fuel. That means that ships crossing the ocean are emitting a lot less sulfur aerosols, and that means there's a lot less cloud formation. So this was a hypothesis that was put forward a couple of years ago to the reduction in aerosols might be explaining the increase in heat, because the masking effect, this reflective masking effect that the aerosols created, which was masking the heat, just is much thinner now. There's less of this mask. So this has been hypothesized for a long while now, and in 2 or 3 episodes ago we discussed a new paper talking about the disappearance of low elevation clouds over the oceans, and this seems to be a bit of a missing link in the research. It confirmed this idea that lower pollution from ships is what's causing this heating. And we've now had further confirmation of this from your friend James Hansen, who I know you're a big admirer of, the godfather of climate science, who's just in early February published this new paper with a big team of authors. The title is "Global Warming Has Accelerated." It's really definitive, and the subtitle is, does the United Nations know about this? So the bulk of that paper is providing further confirmatory evidence through modelling and other sources of evidence that it is this aerosol masking effect, or the reduction of the aerosol masking effect, that's causing such a problem right now. And the paper's caused quite a stir. One of the conclusions that it generated was that 2 degrees is dead as a target, and which is quite something when lots of people are still only just coming to terms with the idea that 1.5 is dead, and some people refuse to even acknowledge that. What did you think of Hansen's paper?
Yeah, well, I think for me as a communicator, one of the most interesting things in it is the title, that's basically asking, are the UN and the general public aware of the level of danger that they're in? Really, that's the sort of frame. And I feel like I could confidently answer that question, and the answer is no, they don't know. Certainly the average person that you meet on the street, I don't think they have any idea how much risk they are collectively being put in. But also, what's very interesting to me about this topic of aerosols, and it came back to me the other day, I just remembered the story, was that actually James Lovelock was working for Shell, I think in the 1970s, and discovered that the aerosol pollution that accompanies burning fossil fuels is going to reduce the felt impact of the heating. They told him not to share it with any other people who weren't working for Shell, and then they buried it. The rapidity of what's happening at the moment, which is obviously like scaring the living shit out of people who are paying attention, who know who have a good handle on stuff, is also completely unsurprising, given that we knew that this was a phenomena people have been talking about it for a long time. A lot of gatekeeping. I think we've talked about this before in the science community about, no, you can't talk about the aerosols because we don't really have the data and we don't understand clouds, or we don't know this enough, that enough, you can't talk about it. Well, the truth is that when you take away this particular element of pollution, you will feel the impacts of what we've done to the effect that they should have had. And I just think it's interesting that the fossil fuel industry haven't just lied to you about the fact that, their product is going to cause the breakdown of our climate system, but they also didn't want you to know that you would let it go on for so long because you wouldn't fucking notice. And to me, that's like, they stabbed you twice, but you didn't know. So, I think it's particularly interesting when you start to sort of examine it from a narrative perspective and a communications perspective, because we also know now from various research that like one of the most effective stories that you can use to explain the injustice of the climate crisis and the willful, intentional creation of it by vested interests and money and powerful companies. One of the most effective ways to talk about it is the whole narrative of like, well, they knew and they hid it. They knew and they hid it. I think there's something very interesting about the fact that they also knew this. So there's a lot of people in the science sort of space who'd be going, oh no, we couldn't say anything about it. Like, at the start of Extinction Rebellion, people were saying to Roger, no, you can't talk about that. You can't talk about aerosols because we're not sure and it's not, you won't be credible, and, we can't hang around with you if you say things that aren't credible and all this kind of stuff. Well, if Shell knew in the 70s and buried it, someone fucking knew, didn't they? And they definitely knew in 2019. And so it's painful to watch this kind of, the process of sort of gradual uncovering of more and more layers, in a way, of like sort of getting these things out to the fore. And I guess another thing on that, the topic of Earth systems basically creating so much more carbon through wildfires almost offers us an opportunity to think about how we situate ourselves in relationship to the living world. Because I've quite often been saying in, teaching, when I teach fashion, when I teach sustainable fashion, and I always include this slide in the piece that I do about climate, which says, we probably think that we, have come to like dominate the natural world, and that like we're not really part of it. We're separate somehow from everything else. If the Earth systems are going to start to run away out of control in precisely the way that we always got told we were like scaremongering and like going too far, and you can't guarantee that everything's going to go extinct because it's never done it before, or all this sort of stuff, that actually it is potentially an opportunity to just zoom out and do something very significant in a narrative sense, in a sort of communications and storytelling sense, to understand our sort of smallness and the kind of the power of the Earth's, forces, to be actually like, we haven't tamed nature, we haven't controlled Mother Earth. Perhaps we might need to, bring forward something that helps us to understand ourselves as human beings with a bit of with a bit of fucking humility, basically, because it's, the things becoming beyond our control are going to be, I think, a very problematic sort of issue for people, particularly in a Western kind of scientist and the sort of the control paradigm, and the sense that we understand everything and we can change things, and we actually can't control everything.
It pulls the rug from under 500 years of Western thinking, this idea that we can mould the world to suit us, and it's really important that we evolve beyond that thinking and realise that actually we don't have the power. Take how we manage the land and how we manage water, for example. for hundreds of years, we've been engineering our landscapes to get water off the land as quickly as possible, to drain everything as quickly as possible. And we were like, we control this system. We can engineer this system to suit our needs. Now it turns out that worsens flooding under different, under changed weather regimes and stuff. It worsens flooding. So we're having to not just undo the engineering, but undo the mindsets that led to us thinking we could engineer the way out of the problem. Because now we realise that the way to limit flooding isn't to get the water off the land as quickly as possible, but to hold the water on the land as quickly as possible. And the way that you do that is not through engineering, but through nature, by encouraging nature to hold this water as a sponge. But making that switch of approach involves an admission of defeat, a massive admission that we're not in charge. And I think that's such a big mental stumbling block for us as a society as a whole, and for many people as individuals as well.
Yeah, and it makes me think, so I saw you write something on LinkedIn a little while ago about this bats and newts story, which is, it's the same, it's very similar site of discussion, isn't it? Because the sort of the government saying like, fuck bats, people want roads, sort of thing, is also sort of plays in, doesn't it, to that exact dynamic of like, we want to control things, and actually the way that we control our landscape and the way that we get around in cars and aeroplanes is obviously far more important than a few frogs or whatever. Yeah. And like, tell me about that.
And it's explicitly saying that, it's also explicitly reinforcing this idea that we aren't part of nature. So when we are conserving nature, we're doing it for the newts. We're doing it for the bats because, they're nice and we like them and they've got as much right to live here as we do, and we've got no right to make them extinct. So that has been the conservation message since forever, right? Let's do it for the pandas and the newts and the dolphins because we love them. And for decades, conservationists have been saying, come on everyone, let's do it for the pandas. And everyone said, yeah, but fuck off, because no, I'm not, I like pandas, but I'm not going to give you money. I'm not going to make this a voting priority. I'm not going to change my behaviour to stop eating meat, even though I know that eating meat is destroying the rainforest. But the way we've presented nature, and the way we've presented nature conservation, is we've said, this is an altruistic quest to do it for other species. So we were talking in a previous episode about climate populism and about mainstreaming our messages. And I just think, so long as we're talking about conserving nature for the benefit of the pandas, it will always be a niche thing that is not of concern to people. But of course, we're not conserving nature for the pandas. Ultimately, we're talking about our life support systems. I just think we're massively underselling nature. If we say, let's do it for the dolphins, we're massively underselling the fact that we cannot survive without this stuff. Yeah. So in response to what Reeves and Starmer said about, a choice between newts and bats or growth, we're going to choose growth, is in response to that, lots of conservationists have stood up and said, no, we're team bat, we're team newt, we're going to defend the bats and the newts, right? And I think, that's admirable, it's nice, it's wonderful that people want to stand up and defend the newts, but I think it's completely playing into their hands, right? So they have deliberately tried to reduce the natural world to two ugly species that people don't like, right?
One of which gives you COVID.
And the other one gives you warts and is used in witches' brews and shit like that. So, they've deliberately reduced biodiversity to newts and bats. And they've deliberately turned it into an argument between something they know the public doesn't care about and roads and airports. So they've engineered the conversation. So the question becomes, what's more important, a few newts and bats or roads and airports? Because they know that for a large majority of people, the very obvious answer to that question is roads and airports are more important than newts and bats.
Yeah.
So we need to shift the terms of this conversation.
Yeah.
We're not doing it for newts and bats. We're doing it because it's our fucking life support systems, and if we don't, everything will be destroyed. And I just think it's really difficult for me as like a lifelong conservationist. I've always been interested in conserving other species, and that's a message that works for me, and it might work for you, and it works for everyone you're watching, because we're nature lovers, and this is important to us. But for the vast majority of people, it's not. And I just think we need to adapt our narratives, the stories we tell, to make nature relevant for people. The reason we are not destroying the natural world is so that we can survive, not for newts and bats, I think. So yeah, this is something that I write about a bit in conservation journals, stuff, trying to try and just wake up the biodiversity conservation sector to the fact that it really needs to make itself relevant to the rest of society. And I think if the people like Reeves and Starmer, who are trying to do away with our environmental legislation, if they're deliberately focusing the conversation on newts and bats, that's a very clear indicator of their strategic thinking. And so for us, I just think it would be a mistake to play into that game.
Yeah, I mean, I've said before that, I think the way that Keir Starmer has lent into the culture war kind of dynamics in the tabloid media, saying I won't be held to ransom by eco zealots and morons and blah blah blah, all this stuff. It is really concerning, from a sort of creative communications perspective, that they are very happy to play into the tropes that are used by the right if it helps them to achieve their sort of whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. I'm not quite sure, with all this, conflicting messaging about growth and, doing a transition and, not doing North Sea licenses, but yes, expand Heathrow Airport, and it's all over the Ocky, isn't it? And it's not been clear sort of what they're really about, and it's communications approaches like that they make me feel quite chilled, really, because I don't think it's all right to have a supposedly Labour government that is happy to sort of wage into the culture war of all of that. I suppose the other thing that makes me think about, Charlie, is that in terms of do it for the something else, it's very resonant, isn't it, with the philosophical problem that I think a lot of people have got with charity and third sector stuff. It's help the poor people by choice, because you decide to do it, because it's a bit altruistic. It's not seeing people as being deserving of solidarity and support all the time, and that we should all be much more knitted together in a sort of in what I think is the spirit of kind of mutual aid, versus charity as a concept. It feels like it's exactly the same problem. We've been going bit of charity for the newts, that'll do, that'll help them, and actually what we should have been saying is that's my brother. And it's interesting to me because it feels like it's on a parallel with a lot of the direction of travel where I see people's thinking going in terms of human systems. Human solidarity is also something sort of that's basically the same with, the sort of non-human, more than human world.
Lots of what is always sold as altruism is enlightened self-interest, ultimately. I mean, as you say, the government's messaging is all over the place, but they've been, when Starmer was talking about the zealots and the NIMBYs, he was talking quite specifically about a small number of activists, one in particular, Andrew Boswell, who's a former Green councillor in Norwich, who's been taking the government's various government infrastructure schemes to court and been finding that they are unlawful because they don't take full account of their impacts. And this was something that Starmer was very specifically saying, is that we can't have activists using the legal system to put the brakes on big infrastructure projects, which is quite extraordinary when the reason the courts are able to put a brake on the infrastructure projects is because the infrastructure projects are not lawful. The government is trying to do something that's not lawful. To me, that's quite a significant aspect of this picture here, and yet we're journalists aren't questioning the government when the government says, we really shouldn't let people take us to court. Journalists should be saying, you really shouldn't be trying to do projects unlawfully, but they're not. So anyway, there's been this whole bunch of projects increasingly found to be unlawful. So infrastructure and fossil fuel projects. And it's quite interesting, the legal arguments for why they've been found unlawful. The reason we're talking about this now is because the permissions that were granted to exploit the Rosebank oil fields were found to be unlawful in a Scottish court 2 weeks ago. So the presumptive license that Rosebank has been granted has been found to be unlawful. So it's not the end of the story. There'll be government appeals and all the rest of it. But the reason it was found unlawful was really interesting, and it stems back to the Sarah Finch's campaign against the Horse Hill development in Surrey, which, if you remember, was found to be unlawful because when they'd done, so any development has to do an environmental and social impact assessment to see what damage it's going to cause. And they, in their assessment, they found they only calculated the emissions that would be caused by exploiting the oil field and pumping the oil. They didn't include the emissions that would be caused downstream by burning the oil that was produced out of it. So Sarah Finch took the government to court over Horse Hill, and they won. On that same principle, Andrew Boswell has taken a couple of government road building schemes to court, because in their environmental impact assessment, they calculated all the emissions from constructing the road and destroying the habitats to build the road and stuff. They didn't calculate any of the emissions from the additional traffic that would be induced by building the road. What's interesting about all these court cases is that they are asking about the scope of the impacts of these projects. And when we talk about emissions, we talk about three scopes. So scope one is the emissions you generate on site. So in this building, if this building was heated by oil or gas or whatever, that would be scope one emissions from this building. Scope two emissions is the emissions from all the energy you buy in. So the electricity that we're buying into this building is scope two. But scope three emissions is literally everything else, like the emissions of the staff commuting to this building, or the owner of this building taking a flight to go do something else, or the products built, the products manufactured and sold in this building, the emissions they cause when they're used or whatever. So scope three is everything else, and for most things it's the vast majority of their emissions. But almost every time when you see a company say it's going to put in place emissions targets, it never includes scope three. It's always just scopes one and two. So they're missing 98% of their emissions. With these infrastructure projects, what courts are ruling is that scope three emissions need to be included in the environmental impact assessment. And this same principle has now been applied to the Rosebank decision. And that's why the Rosebank has has been found unlawful, and there's a temporary break on that project. Obviously, I mean, as you know, it never. These things always seem to be temporary. There's always appeals, and they go up. Heathrow is a great example. The expansion of Heathrow Terminal 3. That's a battle that's been won in the courts multiple times over decades, and yet it just keeps being brought back. Yeah. So it's not the end. Yeah,
and when I recently went to see the people outside court because of the appeal for prisoners, and Defend Our Juries campaign was there, I made a speech, and someone else who was there who made a speech was Ariba from Greenpeace, and she brought to everyone's attention something very interesting about Keir Starmer, which was that he was involved in a trial of a Greenpeace group of activists many years ago who'd scaled a power station.
Kingsnorth, was it?
Yeah, and actually he was their lawyer. And he got them off by a very innovative use of a defence called, I think, lawful excuse. I found it absolutely fascinating that one person can, move through their career from being that guy. And someone did tell me the other day, they were like, yeah, loads of people wish we could get the old Keir back because he appeared to be like, potentially useful person in some respects, and to now where he's acting entirely kind of against that. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? And I think what I've learned from encountering the legal system in the way that I have in the last few years is that it's a bit like a game. And it's a game of kind of wit and logic, and it's a game of like power and money. And so what I would expect to happen with this, which is what happened with Heathrow, is that you can win a litigation that says it's unlawful because obviously climate, obviously we can't expand carbon heavy infrastructure in that way, knowing what we know in the situation that we're in, and we desperately need to reduce it. Why the fuck do you want more planes? Like that's like a no-brainer situation for me, that you could invite anyone to make an assessment of that, and they'd say, well, yeah, you probably shouldn't build it, should you? But actually, the fact that that's sort of won in the courts, and then everyone was sort of celebrating, only for Heathrow Airport as a company to apply for an appeal, and then it ends up in the Supreme Court. They come with an army of lawyers, tons of money. If the government had fought that, they wouldn't have been able to spend as much money on it. Heathrow is a private company. It could spend more than the government is allowed to on an appeal. So they bring much more sort of heft in terms of like the financial backing of this case. And of course, it defeats the win that they had in the High Court, in the Supreme Court. And then that's it, game over, which is why our friend Tim Crossland then broke the court embargo and put himself in contempt of court and risked going to prison for that. So it's like, it just seems like this interminable kind of merry-go-round in the court system, which is very it's just very infuriating to watch. And I think it's, from the speech I made when I was outside the appeal the other week, was really just to say you can fight things in the courts and you can try and fight the system on its own terms, but of course it's designed not to allow that. So, all power to the people who are going and like spending all of their time doing all of this like legal work, which is like not mine to do. And I think it sounds fucking horrendously tedious and boring, and like it's not a way that I want to spend my time. All good that you're doing that, but also really important that people are still going to challenge things on other terms, which is precisely why all those brilliant, beautiful-hearted people are actually locked up in prison at the moment. So, final thing, what is it?
So the last one I wanted to speak about relates back actually to what you were talking about before, about how some of the most sort of far-seeing voices in our movement are often ridiculed for the things they say, only for mainstream thought to catch up with that very soon after. So Roger Hallam in 2019 did this interview that was massive at the time, and he said, if we don't sort this out, billions of people will die. And everyone said, what the fuck? That is nonsense. And people didn't just sort of ridicule the idea. They used it to undermine the validity of Roger as a sentinel. They said, don't listen to this guy. Don't listen to Extinction Rebellion. They're saying bullshit nonsense like billions of people will die. This is clearly not credible. These people are not a credible source. So in January, there was a report published by the University of Exeter in collaboration with the Institute of Actuaries, or the Institute and Association of Actuaries. I can't remember the exact title, but it's an insurance industry body. So professional risk assessors, the best risk assessors. This is people putting the best risk assessment minds to the task of protecting global capital. So they're serious about this, right? And their report said, if we don't get serious about this, and if climate change continues to track, the scenarios we're on, then we risk 50% decline in GDP by 2070. And this was interesting, actually, because all the headline in all the newspapers was 50% decline in GDP. It was like, oh no, people are going to lose money. The other finding was that if we hit 3 degrees by 2060, 3 billion people could die. So firstly, let's be clear, this isn't a prediction. They're not saying this is what is the most likely outcome, but it's a possible outcome. It's an outcome they're taking seriously. If things go badly from here, 3 billion people could die by 2060. So firstly, how fucking bizarre that you could produce a report which says 3 billion people could die, and the journalists say the headline is 50% decline in GDP. How the fuck can you pretend that's more important than 3 billion people? But the second thing is that here are some of the world's most serious and conservative people saying 3 billion people could die, less than 5 years after Roger and XR were absolutely ridiculed for saying the same thing. And when Roger said that was quite a big story. That was reported across media. Here we have a vastly more credible voice saying the same thing, because it's the University of Exeter and the Institute of Actuaries, and nobody reported on it. So the Guardian reported on it.
Yeah.
I think maybe there might have been something in the BBC, I don't know, but it was ignored. And that's interesting too. It's like, if you're going to pretend not to take an argument seriously, or if you're going to pretend that the person making an argument is not a serious person, then you can ridicule them.
Yeah.
As soon as someone very, very serious is saying the same thing, you can't ridicule the argument anymore.
Yeah.
So the only thing you can do is ignore it.
Yeah,
and that's what they're doing.
I think what's also really, really fascinating to me about this whole thing is that at that time, I remember it very, very well, there were quite a lot of people inside the movement who were arguing, very distressed about the fact that Roger was making us all, not credible by being who he is and saying the things that he's saying. And even some people who made moves to put out a message of correction, or that wasn't totally correct, and so blah blah blah, really playing into that kind of liberal media space of saying, oh, sorry, we're sorry, and we didn't mean to upset you, and we won't do it again, we won't step out of line again, we won't say the uncomfortable things anymore because we can't back them up. And actually that was an assessment that I know Roger had come to because of the work of certain climate scientists and the things that they'd written in a report which had been published in The Guardian. So it was actually...
he didn't pluck it out of the air,
he didn't pull it out of his arse, do you know what I mean? And he was like, well, based on this information, which has come from a very, very credible climate scientist, I can't remember which one now, you know, that would mean that at some point in this sort of time period, you're going to obliterate such massive areas of the planet that food systems will break, people will starve to death, people will die in trying to, you know, move and trying to get away from an area that is, you know, uninhabitable now, whatever. So, I mean, all these reasons and the complexity of the world system with that much disruption in it is going to mean that, like, lots of shit breaks down and, you know, people are going to get hurt. And I just think the interesting question for me is, like, how can we have a useful conversation for the benefit of the movement so that if people find themselves in positions like that, we don't throw them under the bus, because I've always been a very big advocate of don't throw people under the bus. And to then have, like, a mature conversation about what might be the problem with it. And you might be able to say, well, for the benefit of the health of inside the movement, let's talk about it in, like, great detail. Because, okay, here's a person who's on a bit more of the conservative end of the science communications thing. And here's what Roger meant and what he was thinking and what he's been reading. And what about this and what about that? And as we move along, to be able to have the organisational memory to go, oh, see, that was unfortunate that people sort of collapsed in the face of Andrew Neil having a go at you, saying, well, I don't believe that. So how much climate science have you read, Andrew? Because I bet it's absolutely fuck all. Like, so actually, how can we carry on making ourselves stronger, I guess, in the face of what is accelerating? And for me, it feels really important that we don't miss those moments where actually it's so it's so resonant for people in a way which we were feeling 7 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever, that when it gets to that moment where lots of people who have previously not been aware of something like that, becoming aware of something like that, that we are still sort of poised and ready to be able to help those people at that moment of realisation or acceptance, because we've gone through quite a journey of it ourselves. And I think sometimes what we forget is that sort of the attunement of XR at the beginning to, like, grief, to people's emotional reality, to how difficult it is to, like, really square up to this stuff, is like the whole world is on, we're all in different positions along this journey of, like, realising what's going on. And for some of those people at the beginning of that journey, I sometimes worry that we've almost forgotten that some of the stuff that we did at the beginning still needs doing now, and that some of the things that we were saying need to be held up to say, you see this, we were actually right, and you weren't listening then, but could you listen now, right? Because we are credible, this is giving us credibility. And I've been talking to people about sort of, how do you find a good way to say, I told you so, which is, you know, also a big challenge, because nobody likes anyone who says that, right? But I'm really curious if we can explore ways to be able to do that, because I think it's going to become more and more necessary if we want to dig deep into that credibility that we have, rather than sort of move away from it and allow things to just sort of tumble forwards into the new reality. What is that way that we can work in terms of, like, with each other and ourselves, and also with the sort of outside world or the general public in the communication sense, because it's going to be very important. And I feel like there's certain people I know who are working on things like leadership work, to think about what kind of qualities a leader of the future is going to need. And if you've, like, completely derailed our climate system and everything's unpredictable and it's complicated and you have a lot of compound impacts starting to happen, then you're going to need people to be in senior positions of responsibility who can understand all of this stuff. And you didn't need to understand that in the past because the world was such a stable environment to work in. So for governance or, business management or managing massive amount of resources, you just didn't need to have that understanding of complex systems and compound risk and all of these other things, but you will need that in the future. And I feel like the intellectual effort and the spiritual and psychological effort that's been made by lots of the people I know in the climate movement is testament to the fact that some of those younger people that we both know would make the ideal future leaders, because they do totally understand this stuff, which is really, really complicated. And just heartbreaking, really, isn't it, to be sat in a position where the biggest, worst liar in political history has taken over in America again, and that it seems like what's actually on the table for the political offering at the moment is, would you like this shade of ignorance or that shade of ignorance, not would you like the brightest, best people to be able to take on these things head on.
It's just extraordinary, actually, because we actually live in a society, in our Western world, our society, it venerates leadership in a crazy way. We have this weird cult of leadership, certainly in the business sector. You walk into W.H. Smith at train station, half the books in that thing will be about how to be a leader, right? There's a whole fucking industry of corporate leadership. And yet, in just unprecedented planetary emergency, our global response is really defined by the absence, utter absence of leadership. And, not just in climate, but you talk about Trump, here we have a country being, explicitly destroyed, and there's where's the leadership in response to that? I'd not really thought of it in those terms, but it's exciting to hear to me that there is this work and this thinking about how to train and bring forward the leaders of our transitioning society, because we do desperately need that.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks for that, Charlie. And we'll be back again soon with loads more news. In the meantime, keep on being leaderful in Extinction Rebellion, and we'll be back.
Thanks, everyone.